everyone, Alistair Gold here. I hope you're staying safe and healthy among which is obviously a very strange time we're all living through right now. I promised, didn't I, last week that if you asked your questions underneath my last video, I was going to try and answer as many as I could. So I've gone through them all. There were a lot of questions, and thank you very much for asking them all. And what I've done, I've got them down to 31. There were far more than that, but what I think I've done is essentially with these 31, I'm kind of answering everyone. Sometimes there are slightly repeated questions, and what I've done to try and be fair, essentially whoever got in there first, their question gets answered if it was on the same topic. What I would say, obviously, I'm going to warn you straight off with 31 questions, and people know how I do like to talk. I'm going to try and keep them as kind of not quite quick fire, but as not waffle on too much about each one, but this could be a slightly longer video than normal. But we're going to cover a lot of topics, a lot of stuff. There might be no football happening right now, but there's plenty of Tottenham Hotspur stuff to talk about. I'm looking down at the many, many questions I've got to get through. So let's crack on. See, I've already gone waffling for a minute and a bit already. So let's get straight into the first one, which is Mark Shaz asks, are the rumours about us signing Paulo Dybala likely? Obviously, these are new rumours. We haven't gone back in a time machine to last summer. There have been a few bits floating around about Dybala again. What I would say, I do wonder personally, I think whether that moment has passed, whether that was someone that Pochettino would have loved to have at the club, a fellow Argentine. He previously had rated him as an absolute world-class, one of the best players in the world. And then we know what happened next. Spurs did legitimately try and have a go from a proper, serious, concerted effort to try and sign him from Juventus, but it just became too difficult towards the end, especially those image rights were a bit of a nightmare. Can I see it under a new coach? I'm not entirely sure. Dybala's had quite a good season. He's all he really wanted. He does love Juventus. He just wanted to play. And he's now kind of playing football. It doesn't matter. Previously it was all about Ronaldo, and I feel this season, obviously before everything stopped, he was having a good season. Obviously as well, he has actually tested positive for the coronavirus himself, although it doesn't really have a bearing on the transfer thing. It's worth mentioning him and how tough he found it. He's just said how difficult it was, and this is a young guy in his mid-20s, really struggling to breathe after walking a few steps and things like this. So just kind of a little reminder within that about how difficult this is for people of every age, and how we can't just see this as something that affects the elderly, and why it's so important that, unless our work is essential, that we stay indoors. Sorry, I'm going to get a bit preachy there, but, you can kind of see what's happening out there in some places as well. But no, back to Dybala on topic. I can't see it now. I do feel that was a moment that's kind of, there was a potential window opening to bring him in, but it just proved too difficult to do, and I'm not entirely sure that's likely to happen again this summer. We'll come on to the transfer window a little bit later. I remember there's a question that kind of touches on that. Jamie Lord asks, do you think Tottenham will ever reach the heights of the 2016-17 season again? I think they will. It was a brilliant season, wasn't it? It was kind of Tottenham, the Pochettino Tottenham at their very peak. That kind of snarling, aggressive, pressing Tottenham with loads of goals in it. Really tight, mean defence as well. It was a fantastic team, and it very much was worthy of more than it got. Some silverware was definitely merited for that season. But what I've always felt about football, and I've always said this to anyone that kind of asked about it, I always feel football is so cyclical. It goes in cycles. Probably, the people watching some of the absolute dire football in the early part of this of the 2000s were probably thinking, oh my goodness, we'll never see a good Tottenham again. And Pochettino for a couple of years gave Spurs kind of that again, and they were just, a night in Madrid away from capturing the biggest prize of all. It will come around. It will come around. I think I've got a bit of a background in kind of non-league and lower league football before I started covering Spurs, and you just see how often teams go through these cycles and then they kind of come again, and it's no different at the top of the table. Who would have predicted Man City would get money and come back to be the force they are financially? And even Liverpool hadn't won the title in years, and then suddenly bang, they're back again. I've no doubt that Spurs will hit the heights and hopefully do even better. Like I say, that team deserves silverware. MS asks, that's all we've got, MS, why does Daniel Levy handle transfer market dealings without consulting the coaches? to be fair to him, there is a lot of consultation. I think what you could argue is the end result transfer the player that the coach originally wanted, but then that's a very similar situation in many clubs. Sometimes you can't end up with the number one choice you want, but certainly when Spurs go about transfers, it's very much a collective process. You've got Levy in there, the manager, Steve Hitchin, the head scout, John McDermott it was before he left, as the head of the academy, talking about if there's a younger player that could be better coming through. You've got Rebecca Kappelhorn, who's also involved in football affairs as well. It's a real collaborative process, and it doesn't always produce the player that everyone wants. But yeah, I think that's slightly unfair, the not consulting with coaches. You know, I know there's been players that Pochettino turned down. I mean, even most recently, you could say Jack Clark. That was a player who was supposed to come into the Tottenham first team. And Pochettino kind of made it clear that he didn't feel he was ready yet. And so that was why he immediately was loaned back to Leeds. So there is consultation there. There is. I know there's this kind of temptation to paint Levy as the big bad kind of wolf, hoarding his money, Scrooge McDuck-like. I can understand why people sometimes think that, but it's not always the case in terms of stuff like this. I don't think you can pin on that kind of image that people have got. Ruth Jones asks, how did you start supporting Tottenham? I had no choice, really. I was born into it. My dad was a massive Tottenham supporter. Strangely enough, my first game, as weird as it sounds, was watching Luton beat Arsenal. I think it was called the Milk Cup final back then. God, I'm trying to remember what year that would have been. About 87, perhaps, at Wembley. Whether that was some kind of weird induction as a young Tottenham fan to see Arsenal lose a big final to a team like Luton, I don't know. But yeah, it's just something I was born into. Kieran Gilbert asks, do you think the coronavirus will affect Spurs doing a naming rights deal for the stadium? I wrote a little piece on this the other day, actually. I do feel it's going to have different elements to it. I think financially, a lot of clubs are going to really struggle. I mean, obviously, we know teams down the football ladder are absolutely going to be really, really in trouble because of this, and how, you know, the football authorities help them, and possibly the government as well help them is going to be a major thing. But I think when you get to the top of the scale, they're going to suffer as well. We're not obviously going to talk about the degrees, because like I said before, my lower league kind of background, I know how difficult this is going to be for those clubs. But certainly in terms of things like that, I think it's going to put a little bit more pressure on Spurs to get that naming rights deal done. They've been fussy so far. You know, they've had people have been interested, but they haven't really kind of pushed it forward because it hasn't been the right deal for them. You know, it's never really got to a serious stage. And I think this will put pressure to kind of look for those deals that are out there. Spurs are going to be one of those. It's going to be very interesting to see what happens with the season next, and I think we'll come to that a bit later. But bearing in mind what happens with that and finances and TV money and revenues, gate receipts, things like that, I think it is going to. I'd say it goes the other way. I think it's going to push Spurs into maybe making a deal slightly sooner than they wanted. I mean, it should be stressed that they budgeted for the stadium without naming rights, so it was financially secure and ready to go without them. But that infusion of cash, which would be a big deal, if it's anything like the American stadium rights deals that you see out there, which are upwards 300, 400 million or more, yeah, I wouldn't be shocked if they step up their efforts on that front, Tottenham. Elliot Graham, he's stuck two questions together. First one, what would Mourinho's key signings be considering the budget restrictions? Yeah, that's key. I know people would love a massive overhaul. You know, I see it often in the comments, I see it on social media. I just think this summer is going to be a weird one for every club. We know that the season is not going to end when it was, obviously. We know this is going to be a much longer season or fragmented season. What that means for a transfer window, I've got no idea right now. My colleague Joe Doyle kind of got the exclusive yesterday that had been a conference call between the Premier League, FA, and the government, and I think some other football authorities as well, confirming that the plan, or they hope, they're kind of, I don't know if it's almost like a worst case scenario, is to start playing football in July. Obviously that, we all know, is the start of the transfer window. So how that impacts whether you have transfers being able to go while the season is still playing, what that means for players whose contracts end on June the 30th, which, we've got Vertonghen and Vorm at Spurs do, what that means for players like Chelsea are buying Ziyech from Ajax, who's meant to join on July the 1st. I think this transfer window is going to be such a difficult one to kind of work out what's going to happen. Anyone that thinks they can predict it is just guessing. In terms of position-wise, if that's kind of what the question is about, Spurs, they need a new striker. There's no shock there. If they lose, they probably could do with a fullback on each side. If Vertonghen and Foyth both go, which is a possibility, they need two, maybe one. Well, if you've got Dyer going back, maybe one central defender. Some people would claim they need a goalkeeper. Defensive midfielder, they're certainly lacking in that. I'd say probably the other positions, they're slightly more plentiful in terms of options. But I'd say that's positions. But how many they're going to get? Levy's already said that if Champions League football isn't secured for next season, then the transfer budget is going to go down again. I can't imagine there's going to be a lot of money out there to spend, which is why I think they've been looking at the likes of Willian and people like that. The second part of Elliot's question was, is a director of football the answer? I believe personally it is. I think it's something that Spurs have been lacking. I know Steve Hitchen has been kind of doing everything he possibly can as the chief scout, but his role isn't as all-encompassing as a director of football is. And sometimes I think you need that middleman between clubs. Spurs obviously had it with so many there. Paul Mitchell, Franco Baldini, Damien Comolli, Frank Arneson. And these are all guys that are so connected in the world of football and with various clubs that they can maybe get deals done that, say, just Daniel Levy ringing up a club might not make happen. That little kind of filter, that level of finesse maybe, and that also kind of acts as a bit of a buffer between the chairman and the head coach as it is now as well. So I think personally it is the answer. And then Luis Campos obviously is a great shout. It's someone that has massive respect for Mourinho and has already said in the past that he'd follow Mourinho wherever he went. I think Spurs made a bit of an effort to try and get him when they got Mourinho and Sacramento came in from Lille as well. And I do think Campos is one they'll revisit in the summer or maybe earlier to try and get. They've certainly got a lot of bargaining time at the moment, but again, it's down to those finances. I'm really aware that I'm over-answering on some of these, so I'm sorry. I'm going to push straight on to the next one. Tim Parrish asked, do you think the Big Six will be the same as normal going forward? I think it's evolving. I think, as we said before, Tottenham before probably weren't in that Big Six before probably Martin Jol came along. They'd slipped out of that pack, and I think, as I say, it's all about cycles, and I think you'll see the likes of Leicester are pushing back into it. They're league champions before. Sheffield United and Wolves, certainly Wolves, I think there's going to be a bit of staying power there. I wouldn't be shocked if they're a top six side, and it's so easy for teams to drop out of it, especially if you don't get the Champions League football and those finances aren't coming in. Yes, I think the top six will change, and I think it will continue to alter every 4 or 5 years or so. Swagger Leo, which I'm guessing isn't his real name, asks, why are Spurs not putting their trust in Juan Foyth? It's a tough one. Juan Foyth's a talented young player. I think he's got a lot about him, a lot of potential. I've been very fortunate enough to sit down and have a really long interview with him once, which was really enlightening. He's a really clever guy. I just think he hasn't been fortunate in times of injuries. I think he's had some badly timed injuries, which really haven't helped him. If you remember last summer, he came back early to be part of pre-season training, picked up an ankle injury. He'd only had a couple of weeks out after the Copa America, and he came back to help out, essentially, Spurs. He'd only just had his wedding. I think he had about 2 days of a honeymoon, and then joined up with the team going to Asia. And then he got an injury in about the third game of pre-season, if that, fourth maybe. And that ruled him out for the opening months of the season. He didn't really push on. I think he hasn't helped himself on a few occasions. I think he's had opportunities and he's made silly mistakes. The Norwich one, Mourinho had been really impressed with him in Munich in that kind of dead rubber game, and then he gave him a start straight away again against Norwich. And Foyth gave the ball away, albeit there were people behind him. It still shouldn't have been, should have been defended better behind him. But I think it's just that's where the trust maybe breaks down. And then when the player's not playing, and he's playing regularly for Argentina, wants to be an Argentina international. I just think the combination of that maybe means I'm hopeful it would be a loan. That would be great, I think, to suit all parties, to give him a bit of experience and first-team football. But I wouldn't rule out a permanent move either, which is a shame, because like I said, I do think he's a very good player. Really young player. We forget how young these guys are. I think, what is he, 21, 22 at the most? He's got a long career ahead of him. Misha Levi Abramsky asked, do you think Mourinho was the right choice for Spurs? I don't think it's any secret I was a big Pochettino fan. I could see what he was doing with Tottenham, and I felt he was often working with one hand behind his back in terms of the way the club was set up to construct a stadium, and financially they just couldn't kind of do what they wanted to do on the pitch. So personally, I always felt that he was still the man to take the club on. He just needed the backing. That's going to come as no shock to people. And the reason I'm saying that is I think if you're going to say sack Pochettino, which they did, relieved him of his duties, I think bringing Jose Mourinho in was probably the one thing that you could say, look, we're getting rid of him because the results are bad and we want to win trophies. And then if you go bring in probably one of the most decorated managers in world football, I can kind of see it being the right choice in that point of view. Style of football, that's yet to be seen. I think he's hasn't exactly played sexy football so far, and I think there's been, we talk about hand behind his back with Pochettino. I think Mourinho's had a very similar thing, but with injuries, and the club not being able to sign a striker to back up Harry Kane. So I'd say for now, yes. I know a lot of people, or some people, don't agree with that, but I think Mourinho is the right choice. If Spurs are looking for silverware, I think he's the right choice for that. Whether he brings the football that some fans want, that's another thing. But then we get into a whole other long-winded debate about style of football versus silverware. Next question, Tinky Winky. That's wonderful that Telly is asking questions. In order to raise funds, would you sell Kane, Son or Dele? My goodness, that's a tough one. I think logically, if you were going to look at a player who maybe is struggling more and more with injuries, you'd go for Kane. I think he'd raise more money than all of them, possibly all of them put together, to be honest. I think Dele Alli has got a growing number of people on his back, which I can understand the frustration, but when you look at the stats, I still think he is head and shoulders above of many young attacking midfielders his age. I think, when you look at purely goals and assists, I think he's a remarkable young player, and I think there's so much more to come from him. Son is just sensational. I sometimes have little doubts about his consistency, not as much as I used to. Who would I sell? That is such a tough question. I don't want to sell any of them. If you were going to push to sell one, I think it would probably have to be Harry Kane, but it would have to be for an astronomical world record fee that you then immediately buy another very class striker with. Because I just think that maybe Son and Alli can still develop to be even better players, whereas you wonder with Kane whether he's at his peak right now. If you see what I mean. Right. Rich Spurs 61. It's Harry Kane. Does Kane want to move on, and what price would Levy ask for? I think Kane has always been very clear. His aims and ambitions have to be met by the club. And if they are, he is absolutely happy to stay. Could we say that his aims and ambitions are being met by the club or matched by the club? Probably not. They're not exactly going crazy in their attempts to build a title-winning team, are they? Spent a lot of money this season, almost 200 million in all when you include all the add-ons. But that came after, obviously, we know, was it 3 transfer windows without signing anyone? Yeah, it was 3, wasn't it? I think the problem for Kane is even if he does want to go, I just can't see the finances being suitable for Tottenham. The reason I say that is if you look at someone, say, Christian Eriksen, Spurs wanted to offload him last summer, but they wanted over 100 million for him because they wanted a similar deal to Eden Hazard, who left for Real Madrid in a deal that would be worth 109 million all in for a player who was older and also had that just a year left in his contract. So if you think about that sum involved, and now look at Kane, who's 26 years old, as I say, at his peak, despite those injuries, he's scoring goal after. Even this season, he's got 30 goals in all competitions, despite having those 2 injuries. He's got 4 years left on his contract. I think you are looking at a world record price. I think you're looking at silly money. And then, as I say, in this current time, the difficulties and everything that's going to kind of come out of what's happening now, can anyone really afford him? You know, you're only looking then at the mega rich likes of City and PSG. City, perhaps, if Aguero goes, but it would have to be silly, silly money. Because for Spurs and Levy, Kane is the hub of everything, isn't he? He is one of their own. He is the guy that is the face of all their marketing and everything. It would have to be an extraordinary figure for Spurs to let him go. And I just don't know whether anyone would invest that much in one player, especially one who we know is having more and more an injury every season now that keeps him out for a few months. Lappers82 asks, there's a rumour that Spurs are being sold to one of the New York NFL clubs, so it's Giants or Jets. I haven't actually heard those ones. I've heard the many NFL. There's always ones. There's the Kraft family. Is it Jerry Jones? They all just float about all the time. As far as I'm aware, every single time I hear one of these, obviously we do a little bit of digging and they always kind of come to nothing. I think Spurs and Levy in particular very closely liaise with a lot of NFL owners. Obviously, Spurs have got this NFL base now in terms of their stadium. They've done a lot of research on the stadium. Levy lives for a part of the year out in America, I believe, as well. And he really studies the American NFL model of how to run franchises. And I think that's more what it is when they talk. It's stuff like that. I've never actually heard anything seriously about any kind of takeover bid from an NFL club. I think that's just people putting 2 and 2 together and making 7. Razwan Khan asks, when we talk about Mourinho winning trophies, are we talking about the Premier League or Champions League, or are we talking about the Carabao Cup or the FA Cup, and is that enough to keep someone like Harry Kane? I think with Mourinho, he's always had this philosophy of trying to win one, what we'd call a smaller trophy, a domestic trophy, which then leads to others. So it's the snowball effect, first rung of the ladder, all of that. Mourinho, Pochettino was never like that. He was always very clear. Those 2 trophies, the domestic ones, were nice. It was nice for your CV, but ultimately wouldn't change the club. It wouldn't change a player. I kind of get that. I do understand that thinking. But I also kind of do see the merits in Mourinho's way of if you win, you become a winner. It's the mentality. Can you make someone have a winning mentality if they're not winning any kind of trophy, however big or small? And I understand that as well. No, I don't think in itself an FA Cup is enough to keep a player. Do I think it shows them a pathway that there's more to come? Possibly. But let's see. I think Mourinho does guarantee silverware at every club he's been at. And as he said himself, that will he doesn't believe that tradition will break at Tottenham Hotspur. Carl Osborne asked, could you see a shortened season next year? Possibly. There's so many options they have to look at. Like I say, they're looking at a July as a potential. I'm sure I wouldn't be surprised if they come out. I think there's a Premier League meeting this coming Friday, I think it is. I wouldn't be shocked if they kind of extend the date again a little bit. So obviously we're not quite at that July thing yet. I think the July is, I say worst case scenario. It could be even worse than that. This is the thing, we're dealing with such an unknown. How anyone is even trying to make plans is unreal in terms of that. Because football may not return until August, September. But yeah, I was talking about this with someone the other day. It was about possibly a shortened version of one fixture, playing one to each team once in the Premier League next season just to have it. How you do that obviously is logistical, a bit of a nightmare in terms of maybe drawing lots to see who you play at home and who you play away, whether that's fair or not. You could remove the domestic competitions, maybe have one season without the League Cup and possibly even the FA Cup to kind of free up extra time or space for fixtures, do away with international friendlies for a year. I think there's ways they can get around it, and there's also talk of going straight from this segment, final bit of the season, into the next season because the players will have had all these months off beforehand. So they kind of will have had that summer break in the middle, and then you've just got to make sure you look after them during the season and do give them some kind of break in there somewhere. So yeah, a long answer there to just say yes, possibly. John Camiso asks, if Harry Kane goes for 300 million, who replaces him? Someone that's absolutely class. I kind of touched on that. I think they would have to go for a big goal scoring or someone that's guaranteed goals. You know, I know we've had talk of Haaland, the Dortmund kid who's absolutely ripping it up right now. And apparently, if it's to believed, has I think it was a 63 million, was it 63 or 60 million release clause in the summer, which seems very unusual for a player to go to a big club like Dortmund and within months be able to kind of move on. I think it's, without Kane going, I think that's an incredibly tough deal to do. If Kane were to go, say a Real Madrid found the silly money to buy Kane, I think then you're kind of removing one of the suitors for Haaland. And yeah, maybe Spurs do put a big whack of that money towards someone there, because if you lose Kane, you are losing, like I just said, 30 goals a season, 25, 30 goals a season. I wouldn't want to give you a specific name because I think Spurs would absolutely have to go on the offensive, quite literally, to find an offensive player. I think Haaland would be on their radar. Maybe they go back. Maybe we mentioned Dybala earlier. Maybe that's who you do try and throw money at. It's got to be someone of top class level to replace Harry Kane. Mephisto asks, who is the best Spurs player you have ever seen? Oh man, when I was a kid, Gaza was just amazing. Hoddle was just too, probably, I was too young to see him in the flesh, but I used to have a video my dad had got me. I think I've still got it on the shelf down there. Yes, right there. Greavesy's 6 of the best matches from the 80s. And I always remember that because it's got an absolutely amazing Hoddle goal. I think it was against Watford. I think it's a beautiful chip that he does. So technically that's not live, so I can't really count it. But Gaza live, definitely. Ginola was an absolutely stunning player. My favourite players as a kid, because I was a bit of striker myself, so I used to love watching Sheringham, Lineker, Klinsmann were all brilliant. And I think in the more modern era, Bale was just a game-winning player on his own. And in the current bunch, I think we'll probably, it's been revised slightly, the whole Christian Eriksen, kind of because of the way he left in his final year. But I think we'll look back on Christian Eriksen and maybe in later years and realise what a quality player he was. He was some player. When he played well, Spurs played well. Jack Quigley asked, where do you see Spurs in 5 years' time? I'm going to bit of a cop-out answer on that, only because I wrote an article a couple of days back, which is exactly that. Tottenham Hotspur in 2025, what the team will look like and what will happen. And I don't want to kind of spoil it for you because I had a bit of fun with it, got a little bit creative. Certain person returns, that's all I'll say. So have a little look on Football.London because the article's on there and that'll answer your question exactly there. Paul Russell asks, with Spurs missing out on young players like Maddison, Brooks, Grealish and Pereira at Leicester, is the issue lie with Levy or did it lie with Pochettino? I'd say it's kind of somewhere in the middle. I think Spurs, somewhere in the last or recent years, stopped gambling on young British talent. We remember back to the Joel era, and you had Huddleston and Lennon, players like that were coming in, and obviously Danny Rose was bought from Leeds, wasn't he, when he was young? What was he? I think he was about 16, same as Lennon, wasn't he? Was he really young? And Dele Alli we obviously know about as well. Eric Dyer, I know technically he was in Portugal, but still a young English player. Even Ben Davies was young, Kieran Trippier. I just feel for some reason they've got away from that slightly, or a lot. Just taking that gamble. They'd argue maybe because when they're looking for the British players, they're looking towards their own academy more, which I know we've got a question about later. I think in certain cases, maybe Pochettino didn't put his foot down when he really did want a player, and sometimes he would have vetoed a player, as any manager would. And sometimes, like I say, I think it would be in the club just not going the extra mile. We know the mess over Jack Grealish. We know Spurs could have got Jack Grealish for pretty much the price they eventually went in with. Had they done it at the start of the summer when Villa had those problems, the financial issues, Grealish could have been there. And I think Grealish would have been a brilliant signing for Spurs. I think he would have given them the Eriks and competitive kind of other option and backup for him, which really could have made such a difference to last season for him as well. Somewhere in the middle. Calling It As It Is asks, why haven't we produced as many homegrown high-class talents? I told you we'd have an academy question. I think there's another one coming as well. It depends how you go with high class, top class. The function of an academy is to provide some players for the first team. It's also to provide professional footballers that will then go off across the other leagues. Obviously, its primary function, of course, is to put first team players, is to produce them, but it is also to kind of fund itself as well. So you'll get the likes of Cameron Carter-Vickers. Obviously, he's played a couple of first team games, but ultimately he's been out on loans across the Championship in recent years. I know people don't like the financial side of things because it becomes less of a game and more of a business, but let's take him for example. Carter-Vickers' loan fees will have paid for a massive chunk of academy expenditure and how they can bring other players through. They will have paid for all of his development and then some. And then essentially when Spurs do sell him, if you look at the total package of loan fees, the wages that came off their hands and the fee that they'll eventually get from him, presumably because he probably will be sold, that pays for your academy. So there's an element of that. And I like the fact that the players are going back out on loan again. Poch wasn't a big believer on it, but I think they need that. And I think it also helps the academy as well. So when I think it's a little bit unfair. I think you look at it, obviously it's had Kane, it's had Winks. I think Skip's a great prospect. I think people have been a little bit harsh on Skip. I think there's a lot more to come from. I wouldn't be shocked if there's a new contract coming for him soon as well. You look at Tanganga. How can you argue Tanganga hasn't been a massive success? He's still got a lot to learn. He's still a kid. He's 20? I think he's still 20. But I think, so that's Skip and Tanganga in the last 2 years. Troy Parrott, yes, he was brought in when he was 16, but still he's an academy kid. He's been there a couple of years now. These are good players coming through, and there's more to come. There's some players. I wrote a piece yesterday about the ones to watch out for. You've got the likes of Janeel Bennett. I think he's a really good young attacking kind of wide man. Jamie Bowden, Harvey White, both very good midfielders. Dennis Serkin was on the bench, wasn't he, in the FA Cup game against Middlesbrough? Very good young, was he 17-year-old left back? Malachi Fagan-Walcott was on the bench against Leipzig. He's just turned 18, I think, the day after that match. So if we're talking about producing players that are appearing for the first team, they are doing it. I just think maybe, I don't want to sound, hopefully it doesn't sound patronising, but I think I think we see a real great player come through an academy at another club, and rather than maybe seeing that as actually not being the norm, we kind of paint that as, oh, look at all the great young players they've come through. Why aren't Spurs doing that? And I think if you actually look at what Spurs have produced, they've produced a lot of good young players. It's just when and where, and how difficult it is to get into team. Pochettino used to always say, you'd have to be a 10 now to make it into a first team from an academy, whereas before you could be a 7 or 8 in terms of player rating at that time, how good they were, which shows you, Skip was getting in just how good he was. You had Onome, you had Carl Walker-Peters. There were a lot of players that we might not see them as the greatest players in the world ever, but they are players that have got through all of those many, many levels in academy football. There's so many stages that you can drop out. As I said before, I used to cover non-league football, so I've seen a lot of these young players who didn't make it, who got cut at 14, 16, 18, even 21, and they're back in non-league football or the lower leagues. So I think Spurs have had a fair whack have got there. So no, I disagree. I do disagree on that one. We've mentioned him just there. These are quite nicely leading into each other. Fair Play Man asks, what's the latest on Tanganga's new deal? So they're still working on one with Tanganga. With Tanganga as well, I know some people still keep worrying that his contract's up this summer. It isn't. The club have an option to take another year on top of that, which gives them more time to sort it out. If anyone saw the press conference where Mourinho set me up because I hadn't heard about this option and I asked the question about whether he was up in the summer, and he set me up massively for a fall in that one, which was quite funny. I didn't take it to heart. But yeah, they're working on Tanganga. I'd be stunned if that's not wrapped up, as soon as possible. Obviously, in the current climate, these little things might get extended. Right, let's move on. We've got to kind of whack through. Still got a few of these to go. Not too many, we're getting there. Long Check Juan asks, is there a specific reason why our capacity is only 60,000 at the stadium? I think it's a combination of all factors, really. They would have looked at demand, and the stadium hasn't been selling out, has it? So they were probably about right on that stage. I think if you go bigger, it also probably impacted on certain things they wanted to do. Maybe, and this is just me kind of just assuming here, whether that would have caused problems then for things like the retractable pitch, how exactly that worked in a bigger stadium, whether it was just right to be able to deal with that, the amount of space they had to work in, because obviously we're talking about a ground that, unlike others where there's just masses of room around it, we're talking about a very tightly packaged city stadium with listed buildings, like Warmington House so close to it. I think from everything I heard about it, it was very much they wanted to beat Arsenal, they wanted to beat the Emirates and have a slightly bigger stadium capacity-wise to that. But it didn't sound like there was an intention to go silly numbers, because otherwise they wanted to really focus on what would be a noisy, intimate White Hart Lane feeling stadium, but just on a bigger scale. Whereas if you go to, we saw what happened at Wembley towards the end of its time. Wembley having like 30, 35,000, 40,000 it was like a cavernous empty hole, wasn't it really? With a 90,000 stadium that's only a third to two-thirds to a half full. And I think it's all of that combined. Chris Adams asked, could any other chairman have achieved what Daniel Levy has? I get what he's asking here. I get what Chris is asking. I think a lot of people will be disgruntled at that. But I kind of get what you're trying to say. And it's a tough one. I don't think that many out there would. And I know people go, oh my God, what are you talking about? Look at the trophies that, Spurs have won under Levy. It's one, isn't it? I think it is in the 20 years. But I think you'd have to be a certain kind of character, a really focused, not caring about the criticism, to have got all of the stadium stuff and done. There's on the pitch, are Spurs a better side, or I think they were under Pochettino. I think they were a much different side on the pitch. I'd say off the pitch, unrecognisable. I used to go to the old Spurs Lodge in Chigwell. You were talking to people in porter cabins. Some of it was proper old school. I'm not going to say amateurish, because of course it wasn't amateurish, but it wasn't top level. Tottenham now are an enormous club infrastructure wise. They just need now to take the next step on the pitch. So do I think any other people could have achieved what he did in that sense? I'd say not many. I think there's no denying he's a fantastic businessman. I understand completely the frustrations that he doesn't. There's been moments when he hasn't pushed the team on or on the pitch, or given the funds, or pushed that little extra mile. We spoke about the Grealish thing before. But I think in terms of the size of the club, I don't think so. No, I think it takes a certain kind of guy who just, quite frankly, not to be too blunt, doesn't give a crap what people think. He's pretty much admitted that himself, that the criticism doesn't bother him, because he knew what the end goal was. And I think maybe if Spurs eventually get to the end goal, which is obviously the success on the pitch as well, people will probably look more favourably on his reign. If they don't, if he sells up or even sell up before that happens, then people maybe will always keep that kind of thought of him. I don't know. We'll see. It's all a bit of the unknown still in terms of that. Chad Mercer asked, do you think we can still have a successful transfer window without the Champions League? I'm going to really kind of fob that question off, I'm afraid, purely because, as I said, we don't know what this transfer window is going to look like. It's just going to be such a mess. I think we don't know whether Spurs will have Champions League yet or not. If they do decide as a last resort to void the season, Spurs are in the Champions League again. Again, I'm not going to get into all that because I got into it last week, but it's a complete legal mess, whatever way the Premier League go, if they try and void it or make it count as to where it finished, if you get what I mean. Both of those sides are massive legal minefields. I think they have to try and finish the season. Does a full-strength Tottenham without all the injury players, with Kane, Son and Bergwijn all back, and Mourinho having a mini pre-season of sorts before the season starts, Spurs might do it. I think it's a difficult one. I don't think we can really go into that one because we don't really know. Graham Toon asks, how are our under-18 and under-23 teams performing? Do they have as good development as others? As I've said, there's a lot of talent in there. The under-18s last season pretty pushed really hard for the under-18s Premier League title. they really did well. Some really, some players came out of that. Parrott, Janelle Bennett, we've mentioned as well. Malachi Walcott was in there. Dylan Markandale had a really good season. There's some really good young players in there. Harvey White, we mentioned. And then a lot of that now, because of the shift in loan mentality, a lot of the under-23s